Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for an in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, welcome your host, Jessica, with this podcast episode of WORKOLOGY.
A 2013 SHRM survey looking at visas and immigration found that 70% of respondents and 96% of large employers with at least 20,000 full-time or equivalent employees said the ability to obtain visas in a timely, predictable, and flexible manner was critical to their organization's business objectives. Visas are clearly a key factor in the war for talent and developing a competitive business strategy. So, where do we go from here? Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast. I am here with Jason Finkelman of Finkelman Law. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Talk a little bit about your background and why you're the go-to guy to talk about immigration and visas.
Sure. So I've been practicing immigration law for about 10 years. And the focus of my practice is employment-based immigration law. So I'm usually working with U.S. employers who are seeking to bring over highly skilled foreign talent on work visas, and also working with international entrepreneurs and startups who may have a successful business abroad, and they're looking to bring it here to the U.S. It's kind of a niche practice. There's not a lot of immigration attorneys within the realm of employment-based immigration law. So I have a lot of experience in that area and really enjoy working with people, helping them trying to fulfill their dreams to work and grow their businesses here in the U.S.
Give us a rundown, just a short, and I know I'm asking for a lot, rundown on immigration and visas, maybe for CEOs or listeners or people like myself who might have been out of the visa game for a while. What's this all about, and why is it so darn complicated?
Yeah, so immigration from an employment standpoint basically starts with an international person needing a temporary work visa to come here and lawfully work in the U.S. It's challenging for HR individuals and companies to secure those visas because there's not a lot of options within the immigration system to get those work visas for foreign nationals. The requirements, even though there's a variety of work-based visas, the requirements for those visas are very strict, and frankly, they're archaic. They're based on the way our country was running several decades ago. And so those laws really haven't changed for many decades, and the only ways to get people the work visas they need are to fit them into categories that are old-fashioned. And yes, there's some creativity within the law to fit people within those categories, but there's not a wide variety of options to bring highly skilled foreign nationals to the U.S., or even for entrepreneurs and startups to come here to the U.S. And grow their businesses. So there's often a lot of challenges for HR people to get those visas because they're trying to fit sometimes a square peg into a round hole.
All right, so you've given us some good overview. Walk us through how work visas work.
The employment-based immigration system is set up into what's called non-immigrant work visas, which are temporary visas to work in the U.S., and immigrant visas, which is the same thing as lawful permanent residence or a green card. Talking about the non-immigrant work visa category first, there's a variety of non-immigrant visas in the U.S., and each of those visas has different eligibility requirements. Some, like the most popular, the H-1B visa, is for high-skilled foreign nationals coming to work for a U.S. employer. Other visa categories are for high net worth foreign nationals that are looking to invest and start a business here in the U.S. There's options for intra-company transferees, meaning a company working for a foreign company seeking to transfer them to the US-based company and get a visa that way. And visas for outstanding skilled individuals and extraordinary abilities and students and things like that. On the immigrant visa side, the permanent lawful residents, that comes into a different realm because the U.S. is always looking to protect its U.S. workers. So that process is something called the PERM process, which requires U.S. employers to test the U.S. labor market and prove to the Department of Labor that there's no qualified, able, willing, or available U.S. workers that can do what the foreign national the company is seeking to bring in can do. And so they're two different worlds, one being the non-immigrant side, one being the immigrant side. That's sort of the general overview of working in the U.S. as a foreign national.
So where are you seeing the biggest challenge out of those two right now for employers?
The biggest challenge for employers is on the non-immigrant work visa side mostly. In particular, bringing over high-skilled foreign nationals. There is a shortage right now in the U.S. of qualified STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics degreed professionals. The U.S. universities just aren't pumping out enough employees with the STEM skills they need, or U.S. employers need, to grow their businesses. So what's happening is U.S. employers are having to look overseas to bring in the STEM candidates they need to grow their business. Well, what happens is there's not a lot of visa options for foreign nationals with STEM skills. There really is generally 1, 2, or 3 options. And some of those options, like the H-1B, is capped, meaning there is an annual limit on the amount of H-1B visas that are issued each year. And in fact, based on the last 4 years, all those visas are used up and gone on the very first day they become available. So much so that the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, has, at least for the last 4 consecutive years, held a lottery on the very first day, April 1st, for those H-1B visas. And that's the biggest challenge to U.S. employers, because now they're going, uh-oh, I need X amount of qualified foreign workers to grow my business, but now I'm being hampered by this lottery because there's only a limited amount of visas that are issued each year. So that's one of the big challenges that U.S. employers are facing.
It's like the Black Friday of immigration.
It really is. And I mean, I say to people all the time, there's attorneys like me throughout the country that on March 31st take a giant wheelbarrow to a FedEx office and dump tons and tons of these H-1B petitions to make sure they get to USCIS on April 1st. And then we just cross our fingers and hope they get selected in this computer-generated random lottery system, and hope that the employer gets the qualified candidates they need. And it's just a complete and utter mess. This past April, I guess several weeks ago, USCIS received a record number of H-1B petitions. I forget what the number was. I think it's somewhere over 330,000, I think. So they received over 330,000 H-1B petitions for 85,000 available visas. So if you're a U.S. employer, or if you're an HR and you're tasked with getting 10 qualified individuals that you vetted and you know you want, odds are, based on this year's lottery, you had less than a 35% chance of getting one of those employees. And there's not a lot of options thereafter, if you're not selected in that lottery, to get those individuals here in the U.S.
So what do you do? Do you just, if you need all 10 of them to be there, do you just say, okay, all right, if there's a 30% chance, I'm just going to submit 30 candidates and 30 H-1B applications with the likelihood that 10 will get selected? Or like, what kind of alternatives do you have here?
Yeah, so you're perceptive in that sense. So large employers are saying, well, if there's going to be a lottery, Well, then I'm going to play the law of averages. So if I'm Google, for example, and I say I need 50 software engineers, and I know there's going to be a lottery, and I've interviewed 100 candidates that are all qualified for this software engineer position, I'm going to go, I'll file 100 of these H-1B petitions for all of these qualified candidates in the hopes that I'll get the 50 that I need. So what's happening is large employers are flooding the system because they can afford to file tons and tons of these and play the law of averages. Smaller and medium-sized employers are going, I don't have the funds, or I don't have the means to file tons and tons of these H-1B petitions. And they're out of luck because they don't have the means to get more plays in the lottery. And so a lot of them are in trouble because if they can't get this candidate, there are not a lot of other non-immigrant work visa options available for bringing in these foreign nationals to the company. That's not to say there are none, but they are very, very limited. Stuff like the intra-company transferee visa, the L1A, but that requires sending that employee abroad for at least a year to work in a managerial or executive capacity, only to bring them back to your related U.S. entity. Some may be able to get them on what's called an O1 visa, which is for aliens of extraordinary ability. If they can show the candidate truly has risen to the top of their field, but beyond the candidate simply having a bachelor's or master's degree or higher, there's not a lot of options for employers to get the qualified candidates they need, and it's becoming a major, major problem.
Wow. Well, I mentioned the 2013 SHRM survey at the beginning of the podcast. More information from the survey found that the average employer spends a little over $500,000 on the immigration function, while large organizations like maybe Google and some of these other big guys are spending in excess of $1.7 million. So how can the little guys be able to sort of curtail these costs? Is there any other strategy other than maybe some of the things that you talked about that they should consider?
Unfortunately, no. The costs are set by the U.S. government, by the Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Those fees are the same for all employers, regardless of size. To make matters even worse, just yesterday, the Department of Homeland Security proposed that they will be increasing the fees for all employers, regardless of size, probably later this summer or towards the end of the year. And the fees as they are right now are likely to go up on average about 20%. And that each fees would go up a different amount, but overall about 20%. So even the little guy, even the medium-sized employer can expect to pay more going forward in the future to bring over the foreign nationals that they need for their business. There's no real cost management to this. The fees are what they are. They've been set by the Department of Homeland Security, and that's unfortunately what they are. Not much more that can be done in terms of cost or making things less expensive for employers. So yeah, it's harder for smaller and medium-sized employers.
I mean, man, I think about my time in HR and OSHA and some of these other government agencies and the revenue that they pull in. But so I understand why, you look at the line item potentially of this particular immigration, what they bring in terms of revenue for the government. I mean, I'd up my prices too, right? Because it's supply and demand.
Yeah, and employers really have to take a look at themselves and say, is this going to be worth it to me to pay these fees to bring this foreign national to my company? Is he or she going to contribute to my bottom line? And what's happening is, employers are saying, I'd much rather not pay these costs and hire a U.S. worker to do what I need to grow my business. But what has been shown year over year, at least for the last 4 years, as the demand has increased every single year for these visas, is employers are saying, we can't find in the US workforce sometimes the candidates we need to grow our business. And we're being forced to go overseas to find those candidates. Furthermore, if they can't get the candidate here in the US on a work visa, I mean, we talk about the outsourcing. A lot of these companies are going, well, then I have to outsource this position to someone abroad because I just can't find the candidate here in the US with that skill set.
Yeah, or sponsor somebody for their college, maybe bring on 25 folks. I mean, depending upon what you're spending each year, anticipating that what you're hiring is going to be wild. Well, let's take a bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is visa and immigration basics, and I have Jason Finkelman here. You can follow him on Twitter at Finkelmanlaw, Finkelmanlaw. All right, so do you have any advice for HR or talent professionals about how they can better navigate, prepare, or work in this extremely complex and very expensive area?
Yeah, it's the employment-based immigration law system it's a minefield. And it's very, very important to work with qualified counsel to navigate that minefield. There's nothing that says HR or businesses need to use an attorney to go through the work visa process. But the process is so particular, and it is so important to make sure every single box is checked correctly, every single I is dotted, every single T is crossed correctly, because failure to do that can mean the employer has paid lots of money, those USCIS fees, and had the visa denied because of failure to check the right box or failure to dot an I or cross a T. It's important to look at the candidate that you want and make sure that is going to be a good investment for you going forward. The process is expensive, and trying to fit sometimes a candidate into a visa category that's not a classic case, more of a fitting a square peg into a round hole. It can be done, but you have to get creative within the law. So it's important to work with qualified counsel on putting a petition together correctly so that you ensure you get the candidate you need.
Well, and we should just be clear that if you don't check the right box or complete the form the right way, it's a huge delay. It doesn't matter. The money that you spent is lost, right? And
it's not only a delay, it's a denial. These USCIS officers, so every petition that is sent to USCIS is reviewed by hand, by a person. And so they're simply looking for your failure, the employer's failure to complete the forms correctly, because as soon as that form is completed incorrectly, they can go, oh, I don't need to look at any of the other evidence or anything included in this petition that's advocating for this employee. You checked the box wrong, deny, thank you for your money, try again, reapply. And that's a huge waste of time, huge waste of resources, and can result in someone who maybe has been here in college or already working on another work visa being sent home. I mean, I've seen cases where there's a great candidate who's working for X employer and looking to transfer to Y employer, and Y employer files the visa petition the wrong way or requests the wrong status. And that individual who's been here 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years is now going home because that employer failed to complete the forms and the visa petition correctly. So it has dire consequences.
seems like as an employee, like you have to have a lot of faith in your employer to make sure that they are doing everything the right way.
Absolutely, and that's why you hear often from HR people that this employee is emailing me and calling me all the time, and he or she is down my neck about this visa, and they want to be looped into every email, and every day he or she's coming to me with something about this. It's because what's on the line is their their ability to live and work here in the US. And hopefully, a lot of these candidates often say, I want to be a permanent resident. I want to work for your company on a permanent basis and, get my green card and then eventually citizenship here in the US. So yeah, most international workers are like hawks on this because they know there's a lot at stake for them and their families.
Clearly. And I mean, that would be a huge stress, I think, for HR in particular, maybe not because they aren't looking at the bigger, the how it'll, not the bigger picture, but the smaller picture of how it'll impact the employee.
Exactly. And that's why, again, working with a qualified candidate and someone who has the patience to take you as the HR representative by the hand and say, let's walk through this. We're both professionals. Let's make sure we're doing each and every single one of these steps correctly. Because, on a surface level, if we don't do it correctly, you don't get the employee and you've wasted a bunch of time, effort, and money. But on a deeper level, if we don't do this correctly, this potential candidate is going home. And maybe he or she has already left their jobs to come work for your new company. And in the meantime, they got to go home. And that's a lot of weight on an HR representative's conscience,
You mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you work a lot with the startups, and oftentimes those small startups, small businesses don't necessarily have a human resource professional who has the experience or understanding, or maybe the CEO doesn't necessarily understand how important something like this is. What advice maybe do you have for founders and CEOs? How are you going out and interacting with them to sort of to get them the perspective and resources that they need, so they don't come in, maybe they get their Series A funding, not necessarily realizing how this all works. They didn't set aside the budget that is needed to be able to pay the fees or do the work to hire somebody like you to help make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me start by dispelling some rumors, because that's typically what I do when I get calls or questions from international startups and entrepreneurs, because there is a ton of misinformation on the internet, which, again, for whether you're an international entrepreneur startup or you're an HR rep here in the US or you're just the CEO of your own company, there is a ton of misinformation regarding immigration laws on the internet. So again, I advise anyone to reach out to outside counsel to get the best advice you can regarding any candidate. But to your question, there is no such thing in the US as an entrepreneur or a startup visa. There's been plenty of talk and proposed legislation about creating pathways for international entrepreneurs and startups, especially because other countries have created visa categories for entrepreneurs and for startups to come to their country and put money into the economy and hire local workers and things like that. But that does not currently exist in the US. The only options for international entrepreneurs and startups right now derive from having some significant form of capital to start your US business. So most of the conversations I'm having with foreign nationals looking at sponsoring themselves for these work visas to come here to the US, the first question is, do you have money set aside for this? Because USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, who issues those visas, is going to say, look, prove to me this has the ability to grow here in the U.S. Prove to me it has the ability to maybe hire some workers in the future. Create something more than just this little business that you're going to bring to the U.S. for you and your family. So there's a lot of thinking and planning that goes into the process of getting a work visa here in the US if you're a foreign startup or a foreign entrepreneur. But before that, it has to be a well thought out business that has some money that can be put into the US business right away to get it started. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I wonder what the statistics are for foreign nationals that are starting businesses in the U.S., because it sounds like they probably have to put forth more effort in terms of planning and building versus
Absolutely.
somebody who's U.S. based that's like, hey, I'm just going to start this thing in my garage with my buddy.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's much more thinking that goes into it, and more timing and more planning, because there just isn't a entrepreneur work visa or a startup visa. It has to be one of these, like we sort of talked about earlier, these intra-company transferees. So perhaps you have a business abroad that you're already the executive level CEO of, and you've been working for that company for a year, and you want to transfer yourself to the US to start your US subsidiary or affiliate of that foreign company and grow it here. So you already have to show, okay, I've got a business, it's doing somewhat well, and I want to bring it here to the US. Or, I'm an investor, and for the investor visa, you have to show that you have a, quote, substantial amount of money that you're investing into a US business. And that can sometimes be a lot of money. Yeah, it's a big concern.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for talking about this topic today. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Yeah, you can visit my website, www.finkelmanlaw.com, FINKELMANLAW.com. You can follow me on Twitter at finkelmanlaw.com. I'm also on Facebook at Finkelman Law, and also LinkedIn at Finkelman Law as well. I'm always happy to talk to people and answer any questions. So for any of your listeners that ever have any immigration questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call.
Well, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for you, the listener, for joining us on the Workology podcast today, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace HR and recruitment. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs to listen to all our previous episodes. Thanks so much, guys.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.